And welcome back. China's foreign minister pushing back against President-elect Trump after suggesting the one China policy toward Taiwan is negotiable. China also criticized Mr. Trump for taking a phone call with Taiwan's president last December, dismissing decades of diplomatic tradition. Joining me now is Michael Waltz, a former Green Beret commander, former counterterrorism advisor to Vice President Cheney, author of Warrior Diplomat, and a Fox News contributor. Thank you for joining us today, sir.
Hey, thanks so much.
So when we look at the situation going on in China as it relates to what China is now doing, flexing its military muscles along the islands and becoming more aggressive in that posture of showing its defense and offense, what is China trying to say to the president-elect about the future in terms of negotiating with China for trade, for diplomacy, and even for militarism?
Well, I think it's worth remembering that China has tested every new president in recent memory.
That's for sure.
Tested George W. Bush with the P-3 surveillance plane in 2001, tested President Obama with harassing one of our ships, the USS Impeccable. But I think with the President-elect Trump taking the call from the Taiwan president, that he certainly has put the Chinese on notice. There's a new sheriff in town, and as you mentioned, everything is back on the table. I think this tougher line from the United States is long overdue, and I think the Chinese have perceived, the Russians, the Iranians, and others have perceived American weakness over the last 8 years and have pushed hard in all of those areas.
Actually, I'm glad you said that. You talked about that, what appears to be an ongoing axis of thought, if you will, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. What is going on that President-elect Donald Trump needs to be looking out for in terms of all of them perhaps collectively working together? Because we've seen North Korea trying to be provocative and China not doing anything except kind of sitting by and letting it all happen. What does the President-elect have to do moving forward in terms of showing that the United States does have resolve, that it is tough, and that it will not bow to what China's trying to do?
Well, you're absolutely right. In a kind of geopolitical, strategic sense, what we've seen over the last decade is what happens when, we essentially announce to the world, the United States, and President Obama specifically announces to the world that we've taken military force off the table and that we're going to, reach out our hand rather than hold a fist. As General Mattis said during his confirmation hearing, he essentially said that preparing for war is the best way to ensure the peace. That when folks know we're strong, they're going to think twice before taking these actions. And so I think that's the signal we're trying to send now, and what the President-elect is sending. What we need to stop and think about, though, is where are we really prepared to push, and then where are we really prepared to give? For example, if we're going to back out of the Iran deal, we're going to need help in terms of reinstituting sanctions and holding them to account. And where do we then need the Chinese, need the Russians, and need others? So I'm looking forward to seeing this broader strategy unfold.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but somewhere in the middle of all this, the bottom line is what will take place in Israel.
Well, you're right, and that's one other piece, right? So where are our Gulf allies on that? Where are our European allies? And is that something, for example, moving the embassy, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, is that one of the first things we want out of the blocs? My own view is that we have to enforce what is probably one of the world's worst diplomatic deals, which was the Iran deal, and that we have to stop the wholesale theft of American technology from the Chinese through cyber.
What do you think China is thinking of President-elect Donald Trump? Because he is someone who is not afraid to attack or bounce back. And when I say attack, I mean in terms of if you're going to strike him verbally. As we've seen, he will tweet something out or say something to make sure that you know that he's a counterpuncher.
Well, you're right, and the question is, how does the rhetoric, how do the tweets, so to speak, how does that translate into policy? We've seen both through General Flynn as National Security Advisor, General Mattis now as Secretary of Defense. We've seen men who understand the real cost of war They understand that the need to project strength and how that is, really how that is respected overseas. But yet they also understand the downside and the cost in blood and treasure. So it's that balance that I think you're going to see. But I think, at the end of the day, we're going to see a much more assertive American foreign policy to regain American leadership. And frankly, it's something that our allies have been begging for the last decade.
And what will it do to those who are challenging us?
Well, I think it's going to make them think twice, right? What does military force really do? It acts as a deterrent for our enemies. It acts to reinsure our allies, and it is something that you use as an absolute last resort. But for our diplomats, knowing that we're in a strong military position makes their negotiation that much easier. You have to negotiate from a position of strength. And if the entire world knows that we're not willing to use that strength, which has, I think, been the case the last 8 years, it really makes our diplomacy feckless.
There is a change approaching. Thank you.
That's right.
Have a good day.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
You too.